Welcome to the Golden Hinde Podcast, where we'll be chatting about everything from Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the world to the Spanish Armada, Elizabethan seafaring, pirates, to the adventures of our full-scale reconstruction in the heart of London. This episode of the Golden Hinde Podcast is presented by...
Hi, I'm Alan, an education officer at the Golden Hinde. Much of our focus on the ship is the historic details surrounding the original 16th century crew. But our reconstruction, built in the early 1970s, has travelled over 100,000 miles under sail and has many tales to tell. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who is an integral part of the life of the modern Golden Hinde. Hello, Roddy. Could you please tell us a little about yourself and your relationship to the Golden Hinde?
Yes, well, I'm a director of Golden Hinde Limited, and I was part of the original purchase of the ship back in 1984 from the Americans who had her built. So I've been involved in the company ever since.
So what was your sailing background before the Golden Hinde?
I've had a career largely around the marine trade and also been quite a keen sailor all my life. My great-grandfather was in the shipping business in Glasgow, and I suppose being brought up around the Clyde and then latterly around the English coast.
How did the ship come into your possession?
Back in 1977, I was involved in building a marina in Scotland, and one of my business partners looked after the insurance for Crowley, who are a very large tug and barge company on the west coast of the United States. And they had put the money up for the Golden Hinde when she was built in Appledore. So when the Golden Hinde returned to the UK in 1980, having completed her own circumnavigation, she was moored on the south coast of England. And after a short while, the Americans realized that the crew were having a great time. There was a party aboard every night, but they had to find a more sustainable place to keep the ship. And it was decided through this business associate of mine and his contacts with Crowley that the ship should come up to my marina in Scotland. And there she lay for about 3 years. We found some work for her. And then eventually in 1984, we bought her from the Americans.
Oh, that's great. So what were your first impressions of the ship?
The first time I saw her was at the Southampton Boat Show in 1980, when she had just returned. And although I went aboard her, I didn't really pay particular attention. I think largely because she had an enormous covering over all the decks. So she was a sort of all-weather attraction. And also, I think because having just returned from her world voyage, she wasn't really set up in such a way that you could really appreciate the ship fully as she had been built. So I suppose I wasn't maybe overly impressed for some reason.
All right. So well, in that case, did you need to carry out sort of repairs, modifications, anything like that?
Well, in 1984, we decided to charter the ship from the Americans. And so we took her out for about 4 months from Troon in Scotland, and we visited Irish seaports. We took her as she was, but having completed that series of visits over that summer and decided that we were going to buy the ship, we then set about removing some of the additions that had been put on board, more crew comforts, I suppose, rather than anything else, to try and restore her to a more appropriate attraction for the public. And so things like the forecastle, which had a store and all sorts of shelving in there, that was returned to the forecastle we have today. And in the armory, there was a galley with a fridge freezer and sink and gas cooker and all that sort of stuff. So all that came out. So those were the sort of modifications we had to do. The only real repair we had to do initially was a repair to the bowsprit, which had suffered badly in the short period of time since she had been built. So we did that. Other than those minor modifications, we were ready to set off around Britain.
And how many places did you visit when you did eventually sail?
Well, from setting off in December 1984, we went round Britain, and we probably visited about 12 or 15 ports over the next year until we finally arrived in Bristol at the end of 85. And then we made our voyage across the Atlantic down to the Canaries and then across to St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands with all these passengers who were looking for things to do. It seemed a good idea to be in one place where the clientele were changing on such a regular basis. But that didn't really work. The passengers on the cruise ships, they preferred to go for a banana daiquiri on mountaintop rather than come and explore the Golden Hinde. So we sat there on the quay front, the quay side in St. Thomas and Charlotte Amalie. And then after a few months, we worked to deal out with Expo 86 in Vancouver, who were keen for us to go, and finally sailed from the Virgin Islands through the Panama Canal and a 14-week voyage up the Pacific to Vancouver. So that was the beginning then of our main port visits, was when Expo finished in late 1986, over 22 million visitors.
Wow.
And a very successful event. We decided to start visits in Canada initially. We had 3 visits in British Columbia before we set out around the USA. So the next 6 years effectively was port to port. And I suppose in answer to your question, we visited over 200 ports in all.
Wow.
Some for just a few days, others for as long as 4 or 5 weeks. And so it was a mixture of that, really depending on the catchment area.
Wow. So how did the ship operate as an attraction once it was in the port?
Well, we'd arrive in a port, and the way it worked was we put a lot of emphasis into the public relations. In those days, obviously, no internet and no web. So we ran a PR operation. Initially, my wife, Gilly, was the person who made all that work. She had been involved in the Irish Sea visits when we chartered the ship from the Americans. And so we would put out the press releases. We'd make sure that everyone knew around the area, try and interest the local television, regional television stations and radio, get the mayor involved. If there was, once we got to the States, we'd get Coast Guard helicopters and fireboats and reenactors. There's always lots of these reenacting societies who were keen to be involved. So we could get as much sort of enthusiasm and interest wound up before we arrived. So when we sailed in, everyone in period dress, sails up, cannons firing, we'd make sure that we made the evening news or the front page of the paper the next day. And that primed the pump. And so we'd then be set up for that period, a week or two. We'd have all the schools pre-booked, so we've already mailed all the school districts, and we had a sort of central booking arrangement where they could phone. So we had the public and the children coming every day that we were there.
How many crew did you have typically?
Well, it varied. I suppose in the early days, about a dozen. There were once we got in the States, and we had a mothership which provided all the accommodation and backup workshops, offices, all that sort of stuff was done on the mothership. Because as I'd said, we'd taken any of the comforts off the Golden Hinde. Then we had as many as 30 on one occasion. So it was quite a big operation. once we got into the flow of things moving from port to port around the US.
And how many of the crew were experienced in sailing a ship of this style?
Well, there'd be a very few experienced, probably a handful, 4 or 5. They would be the hardcore of the crew. But as the ship was largely in port, and that was where she made her money effectively, then the others who were tour guides, they had obviously taken the job on partly because of the excitement of sailing her from port to port. So the balance was made up with the tour guides. And as time went on, some of them spent a year or 2 with us and became much more proficient at the sailing. So it varied between those sort of numbers.
Do you think there were any similarities between your experiences and those of Drake's crew back in the 16th century?
I imagine probably there were. I'm not conscious of any particular moments where, I realized the limitations of sailing a ship like the Golden Hinde. And I think that's one of the first things you learn is it's never going to do everything that you would want it to do. You have to be a much more thoughtful and careful sailor, thinking things out well in advance. What are the elements going to be doing to you, whether it's tide or wind, the water depths, and just the ship's general ability to maneuver. So I suppose in a way, you realize how capable they were in those days, and how we needed to rethink how we sailed a ship like this.
So what advantages did you have in the 20th century in terms of navigation and operational equipment?
We had a few, and when the ship was built, she had a wing engine. So she had a little engine for getting in and out of ports, and sometimes, as it turned out, often stopping you going backwards quite so quickly. So she had this small engine, which in fact, after Expo, we replaced with a slightly bigger engine. But at the end of the day, because it was a wing engine, so it was a single engine driving only on one side, and that meant that you didn't have a wash of water past your rudder. So steering at low speeds was very difficult with the engine. So we had the engine, but as I say, it was very much something for limited conditions rather than something you could rely upon to speedily get from port to port. As far as electronics and those sort of things are concerned, there wasn't an awful lot around, and we had a small radar, and largely from a safety point of view to make sure that we kept clear of any bigger shipping, not having that ability to necessarily sail our way out of trouble every time, and from a land or entrance to a harbour point of view was handy for that. And over the years, newer stuff came in. We had a weather fax when we went across the Atlantic, and then right at the very end, there were GPSs coming out. But by and large, we relied on the old-fashioned methods, and they were nice additions, but not vital.
Okay, you mentioned a mothership there. Was travelling as part of a fleet more common, or did you ever sail just as the Golden Hinde?
No, we always really sailed as the Golden Hinde. We never, although we did have the mothership joined us in San Francisco Bay in 1987. I bought her in Denmark, and although we had her to support us from an administrative and business point of view, we always travel separately because the Golden Hinde, we'd always stay open till the very last moment, get the last visitor aboard, and then the gangplank would be left on the dockside and the lines would be thrown off and the Hind would be gone, heading for the next port. And the mothership would then pull alongside the quayside, get the ticket booth and the gangway and anything on the shore loaded aboard, and then it would head for the next port where it would be waiting when the Hind arrived, with telephones connected and everything set up. So within half an hour of the mayor welcoming us, we'd be open to the public and the business would be running.
It sounds very organised. Did the crew sleep on board the ship as per the original crew?
Yeah, most of them did. I mean, once, if you were a sort of senior favoured member, and some of the crew, for example, we had a costumer who made all our costumes, but also participated in many of the activities aboard the ship. So someone like that probably had their own cabin on the mothership. So they had those sort of perks, if you like. But the majority of the tour guides, they preferred to live on the Hind. They would come across, obviously, for meals and use the showers and things like that. But I think it was quite a fun place to be, and the people they found their favoured spot on the ship, on the gun deck or up in the forecastle, or they all had their little spots, and come 8 o'clock in the morning, they'd bundle everything into their sea chest and hide it from the general public, and we'd be open for business.
Did you ever sleep in the captain's cabin?
Oh, many times. Just not the most comfortable cabin on the ship.
Did you ever need to make repairs while you were at sea?
Well, I did. One of the things about any passage making is there's always things to do. There are always repairs to be made, but nothing major. I mean, most repairs that you have to do sailing ship are repairs to the rig. It's generally rigging, sails. Those are the things that are wearing. The general fabric of the ship, there might be the odd little, the loo will get blocked, or those sort of things, but it's that sort of level. But as I say, by and large, most of repairs are keeping the rig working efficiently. So that's probably where most of our attention went.
What would you describe as an average day being like on the Golden Hind, if you can describe an average day?
Well, the thing about sailing is, after a very short period of time, your world just shrinks to the bulwarks of the ship. You suddenly, life just becomes the routine on board, and very quickly you get into that sort of routine. You're on a watch type system, so you know how long you're going to be on watch, and you know that if you're off watch, you're either sleeping if you're sensible, you're getting as much rest as you can, but there are duties to be done, meals to be prepared, and those sort of things going on. So it just becomes a routine, and you a lot of the time, particularly on something like a square rigged ship, where you are following trade wind routes, the sails are set, and there's not an awful lot of work. It's not like a more modern sailing boat where you have more potential to make to windward. With a square rig ship, you're crossing the wind or you're running downwind, and because of that, there isn't a lot of sail adjusting as such, particularly in the trade winds. So there's a lot of talking and knocking about and that sort of thing, and just general, keeping an eye on things and making sure you're keeping a fairly good course and looking out for other vessels. But that's
So sure.
It just becomes a very simple survival sort of, sleep and eat and keep watch.
Yeah, I've always imagined that there must have been quite a lot of that for the original crew, having been so many of them as well. It must have been quite a compounded version of that. But they had disease as well, of course. Can you describe, or do you remember bringing the ship down the Thames and into her current home in St Mary Overy Dock?
Yeah, I do. I remember we'd come round from Great Yarmouth, I think was our last visit. We'd been obviously waiting to come into St Mary Overy Dock and the modifications that needed to be done to get us in there. And I remember, coming out the Thames estuary, and then we'd been in touch with BBC News Round. They wanted to do some filming. So we came up the Thames with the tide, but when News Round wanted to do some filming, they wanted us to put the sails up. Well, the wind was blowing us back down the Thames out to sea, so we had to turn around, set the sails, and give them what they wanted as far as some footage. But by that stage, the tide had turned, and Dennis Ord, who I had, who'd done lots with us on the ship, who was a fantastic sailor and captained the ship on many occasions, he decided that he was going to put the nose of the ship into the banks of the Thames, onto the mud, as we were on a falling tide, and really then to have to make our way back up the river against the tide was not wise at that time. So we put the nose onto the mud and sat there as the tide ebbed. And then when the tide started making and we floated again, we were only partially grounded. Then we came off the mud and continued up the Thames. That was a great moment. I suppose the amusing part of it was that because we'd grounded the ship, we had to make a report that we'd grounded, although it was a deliberate one. And the crew were greatly amused because when the pilots and the harbour master came aboard to take the statement about the grounding, we explained what had happened. But Dennis, who wore a pair of glasses, small glasses all the time, put a second pair of glasses on top of his first pair. So that gave great amusement to see the person who had caused the incident having to wear two sets of glasses at the same time.
How did you get past London Bridge?
Well, we then, from that point, we had to take all the masts down before we could go up to London Bridge. So we took all the masts down, we took the engine out, we did a number of things in preparation, and then we had to have a tug, and we had to balance the tide in terms of how much water depth there was at London Bridge and also how much air draft there would have been. So a combination of what was above the water and what was below the water. And it was quite a fine balance to get that right. So at a certain point of the tide, we had to get under London Bridge, and then we had to wait around until the top of a big tide. So we did all this on big tides anyway, but maybe we had to wait an hour or so until the tide really topped out that day, and then we could get in over the sill, which was very tight. That's basically what they'd had to modify the dock. They'd had to take part of the sill away to get the keel through. So I remember it well. It was quite a day, really, I suppose.
It sounds amazing. I'm trying to visualize it, and I can imagine just an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of activity. You used cranes, presumably, to remove the masts?
Yeah, we needed cranes to get the mast down, and we had to carry the masts and spars on the ship. So because they were just too big to start moving through London, too long, they would have been really complicated. So they all had to go on deck, and once we were in the dock, then cranes came in, and we re-stepped the masts and sent the yards back up and got everything ready for us to open. I think it took about 4 or 5 days to get everything back to reasonable normality.
That's pretty quick. That's quicker than I would have imagined, for sure. Do you have a fondest memory of your travels in the Golden Hinde?
It's hard to find a fondest memory. I mean, I think generally the memory I probably have is the Pacific Northwest. I really loved that part of the world. It was a great place to be traveling with a ship. There was lots of interest and expo and then port visits thereafter. Places like Portland, Oregon, and all the way down the West Coast were really, they were great fun. So it wasn't one specific interest, I suppose, one specific event. It was more a period of a couple of years.
Sure, sure. How did your time sailing on the Golden Hind impact the rest of your life and your career?
Well, I think the Golden Hind really took over. The marina we built, we spent a lot more money on the construction, should have been the case because of some mistakes that were made on the civil engineering side. And although we'd filled it and it was working well and is still working well today as part of another big group of marinas, it was time to move on, and the Golden Hind was there, and we were able to extricate ourselves from our land-based operations, and the Golden Hind just gave that opportunity to go off in whatever direction we wanted and to be able to do exactly what we wanted. So my life changed, and obviously my wife Julie was with me in those early years and part of the operation, and then our children came along, and everyone just sort of it just became totally my life. And I really enjoyed the freedom that the ship brought. As I say, you know, one minute we could have sailed up to the Chesapeake and we'd been in Alexandria near Washington DC, and we sailed across to Maryland to Cambridge, and then we thought, well, it's getting a bit cold, maybe we should think about heading south again. So we just turned around, finished that port visit, and headed back down to Cape Canaveral to spend a little bit of time over the winter back in Florida. And so it was that sort of freedom and being able to just do what we felt was right that was great about the ship. It offered that wonderful situation.
Great. I mean, so the final question for you, is there anything you'd like visitors of the museum to know that we haven't asked already?
I think the thing that always sticks in my mind is that the Golden Hind, our Golden Hind, is a real ship with her own colourful history, and she's a stout and very able vessel. At the moment, we're pulling the ballast out of the bilges, a lot of heavy metal coming out from there, and you realise what a well-built little ship she is. And as a modern copy, she really has no equals. There are no ships that I know of that have her impressive accomplishments, and she is built in such a way that she, if we look after her well, will last for a long time. So I think that's something, is to look back and say, this is a little wooden ship that went out and did all this on her own. She didn't have the twin engines and the bow thrusters that some of the modern copies of other ships have. She was a trailblazer. Other ships have gone out and copied what we did. And I wouldn't say they've had our success. They've obviously been welcomed and done well around the world. But Golden Hind still stands out as the one that really was able to do all that. And that's down to her, not to anyone in particular. It's in her appeal. And we were lucky, I suppose, that the rules change for good reason. And the safety elements of vessels like this today are very much tighter due to some horrid events, disasters that have happened. So we're very fortunate to have had our little ship at a time when she could go out and do what she did. And so I think really that's the thing, is for the public to not look at her as a static attraction, but look at her as a really good copy of how life would have been on a ship 400 years ago, but also something that has her own credibility.
Roddy, it's been amazing talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your answers with us. And yes, everybody, do come to the Golden Hinde. You won't regret it. Thank you very much, Roddy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That was the Golden Hinde Podcast. For more information, head over to our website, goldenhind.co.uk. Remember, there's a letter E on the end of Golden Hinde. You'll find videos, blogs, educational resources, and, of course, all the details you'll need to come and visit us. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.